Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rick Hasen of the UCLA School of Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. I'd like to welcome you to the first of our fall events for the 2025 series on preserving free and fair elections in the United States. I want to thank Harley Ham and Ben Austin DeCampo for their important logistical work in making these programs possible. And I want to tell you about some additional upcoming programs of the project. All programs are free, but registration is required. On Tuesday, October 7th, from 12:15 to 1:15 p.m. Pacific Time, I'll be in conversation in person and also online with Nate Persley of Stanford on the topic Lessons from the 2024 Elections for 2026 and Beyond. On Thursday, October 16th, from 12:15 to 1:15 Pacific Time, Guy Charles of Harvard Law School, Moon Duchin of the University of Chicago, Michael Lee of the Brennan Center, and Nick Stephanopoulos of Harvard will join me for a conversation on redistricting and re-redistricting controversies and the 2026 elections. On Thursday, October 30th, from 12:15 to 1:15 Pacific Time, Danielle Citron of the University of Virginia, Brendan Nyhan of Dartmouth, and Amy Wylance of UC Irvine will join me to discuss media, social media, and the changing election information environment in 2026. And on Tuesday, November 18th, from 12:15 to 1:15 p.m. Pacific Time, Ellen Katz of the University of Michigan, Lenny Powell of the Native American Rights Fund, and Joelle Roth of the Legal Defense Fund will join us for the final event for our fall series, the Supreme Court, the Voting Rights Act, and the 2026 elections. As I said, all events are free, but registration is required. You can find all of these events at the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. We'll be putting that link into the chat window for those of you who are watching this recording live. In addition, for the first time this year, we are offering MCLE credit for California lawyers who watch these events. You'll need to fill out a form, and that form will be offered several times in the chat box that is available. And finally, in terms of logistics, again, if you're watching this live, if you have a question for our panelists, you can submit those questions using the Q&A box. You can't use the chat box, but you can use the Q&A box to get access to ask questions. And I'll try and get to those at the end of our program. Well, I'm very pleased to begin this fall series with an outstanding panel on a crucial topic, which is the risk of federal interference in the 2026 midterm elections. It's something I know that it's been on my mind and on the mind of many people that I encounter. Let me introduce our speakers. Marvin Haiman is assistant professor and executive director of the Public Safety and Justice at the University of Virginia. He's also a visiting fellow and research scholar with Rutgers University. He served as chief of staff for the Metropolitan Police Department. He's also served in other capacities in that office. He has also served as director of the Homeland Security Advisory Council for the United States Department of Homeland Security, where he established several key task forces. Liz Howard serves as Director of Partner Engagement in the Brennan Center's Election and Government Program. She's a common visitor to Safeguarding Democracy Project programs. Her work focuses on election security. She has co-authored multiple Brennan Center reports and white papers. Before joining the Brennan Center, Howard served as Deputy Commissioner for the Virginia Department of Elections. And Stephen Richer, who was on our program last spring, is Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center, and he is CEO of Republic Affairs, a communications firm for pro-democracy, pro-rule of law actors. He previously served as the elected Maricopa County Recorder in Phoenix, Arizona. In that role, his responsibilities included voter registration, early voting administration for Maricopa County, which is the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States. And I guess I'm in the largest jurisdiction in the United States here in Los Angeles. So big times. So in terms of format, I have asked each of the participants today to talk for 5 to 7 minutes on the question of what are the risks you see in terms of federal interference in the 2026 election, something that was not even on the agenda of things election officials and election scholars worried about before a few years ago. What are the risks of federal interference in elections, and what should state and local officials and the public do about it? So we'll start with Stephen, then go to Liz, then to Ben, and then we'll have a more free-flowing conversation, and then I'll turn to audience questions. So
Yeah,
Stephen, let me ask you to unmute yourself and kick it off.
great. I don't think I'll run the clock on this, but I do want to point out that it doesn't necessarily have to be pernicious federal involvement in election administration. And one of the things that we've talked about the most over the past year has been the potential decline of CISA, which is, of course, a federal agency that oversees a lot of cybersecurity concerns pertaining to the administration of elections. And the federal government was involved in other ways in election administration over the last 4, 8, 12 years in ways that the vast majority of election administrators would have thought very positive. Now, of course, the name of the game has changed quite a bit, and in no way is that more apparent than with respect to executive orders. The president signed an executive order on March 25th, 2025, that purported to direct states to require proof of citizenship before being eligible to register to vote. It also made a number of changes to the Elections Assistance Commission's certification of tabulation project and certification process. And then the president, more recently, I think in August, teased another executive order that would ban mail voting, that would potentially ban electronic tabulation of ballots. That has not manifested in an executive order yet, but is something that is clearly on the minds of at least some within the White House and the president's broader administration. I think a number of things that other people are looking at are the federal government's increasing interest in voter registration rolls. Now, those who are optimistic about what the federal government is doing liken it to something like the ERIC system, whereby states share voter registration information so that a central hub can run lists with sensitive information against each other, and they can send out information to help states maintain their voter rolls. So let's say if somebody moved to a different state and it wasn't necessarily declared by the individual voter, because remember, we don't, of course, have a national voter registration database in the United States. And so by some reports, including very recently an article by NPR, the federal government is taking that information that they get from various states and running it against the SAVE database for naturalization and citizenship, and then potentially running it against other states' voter rolls list. Now, election administrators have a little bit of concern with that because, of course, the second that any election jurisdiction uploads its voter rolls, they become out of date that minute. And the federal government has also never ordinarily played this role. Local jurisdictions are responsible for the upkeep of their voter rolls, and that eventually pushes up to the state, but it's never been done at the federal level. So how will the federal government be using that data? How will the federal government be securing that data? I think is a question that is very much top of mind. I think from a confidence standpoint, the doomsday scenario that many of us who lived through the past 4 years as election administrators fear is that we have a very narrowly divided United States House that is down to maybe 2 or 3 seats that will determine the balance of power in the U.S. House or in the U.S. Senate, and that the results ultimately don't look like they looked like on election night. This is especially acute as a possibility in states like my home state of Arizona or in states like California that have a heavy percentage of ballots coming in through the mail process that either allow a postmark of election day and allow them to be returned after election day, or just will have a lot of election mail ballots dropped off on election day such that voters won't know 99% plus of the results until 3 or 4 days later, and that could flip the results. If it happened that Republicans are controlling the House on election night, and then 2 or 3 or 4 days later, Democrats look like they're going to take the House, I think it's very easy to contemplate what a narrative might be from the President of the United States and from some of his acolytes who have been talking about election administration a lot over the last 4 years, I think is a polite way of saying it. And then the last thing is sort of the wild card that's been introduced to election administration lately, which is redistricting. California is obviously very important in this conversation, but it was set off by Texas's announcement that it would reconfigure its congressional maps for the purpose of partisan gerrymandering. California and other blue states have threatened to do that or have taken measures to do that for the purpose of benefiting Democrats. Now, some additional red states are threatening to do that to gain more Republican seats. And so, what will that do to confusion? What will that do to administration? What will that do to the election jurisdictions themselves? Because election administrators only administer the election in their assigned election jurisdictions, and those could be a little bit in flux. And then lastly, what will it do to our political system and people's sentiment that the government represents them and that people control the elected officials, not that the elected officials choose themselves. So that's a grab bag of different things that hopefully sets the table, but happy to go into any of those in greater detail. Again, I don't think the federal government's involvement in election administration is necessarily bad, but a lot of the stories that we've read would be disconcerting to election administrators.
Thank you, Stephen. I would add that if you're worried about Arizona being a few days away from announcing congressional winners, in California it could be a few weeks, at least
Right.
if we have close elections, and history holds, and that could be a very tumultuous time for the country. Let me just add before turning to Liz that this is our first event where we're offering MCLE credit, and apparently the form we offered was password protected. So if you go back to the chat, you will now find a form that you can actually use to get credit. And if you're having any trouble, you can always contact us through our website, and we can help you with that. Liz.
You got to work for that CLA. You got to work for the
Yes.
CLA.
Thanks, Rick, and it's so great to be here. I think it's important what you noted in the introduction, which is that this is largely a new concern, certainly for many of the election officials that I talk to. This is something, the potential for federal interference is something that they're thinking about more this cycle than they ever have. And when I'm thinking about federal interference, and Stephen touched on this when he talked about the recent executive order, but it's the efforts by the president to potentially rewrite election law and election policies that are squarely the responsibility of the state. And so Stephen outlined the executive order, which includes demands that the EAC require documentary proof of citizenship when people use the federal voter registration form, and potentially also of concern, decertify some of the voting machines that the EAC has previously certified. So that is a significant concern. I'm also very concerned about the efforts to undermine election officials and our election infrastructure. Many election officials are very aware that the federal government is, in some ways targeting them. Many election officials have received letters from the DOJ Criminal Division asking for access to information about voters in their state and other processes and procedures. We also see the federal government withdrawing and retreating from providing critical election security services to election officials. I think it's important to remember that the typical local election official is a 50 to 64-year-old woman who makes about $50,000 a year. After the critical infrastructure designation in 2017, she was largely informed that she was now responsible for protecting our election infrastructure against foreign adversaries such as China and Iran. The federal government, after that designation, provided access to a lot of support and a lot of services. Many of those services have been rolled back, and DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, has been purged of many of the people that were responsible for providing some of these support services to election officials. Of course, I'm also mindful of some of the concerns that have been raised by Governors Pritzker and Newsom about the use of federalized National Guard troops across the country, and the potential impact on elections. And in response, what can we do? What can election officials do? What we've certainly seen is election officials who have been building up relationships across local governments to help them conduct safe and secure elections. So they've worked to build relationships with law enforcement, with IT, with emergency management services, and with many others. So election officials have ensured that our elections have remained safe and secure in the past, and but they can't do it alone as we look ahead. So these local relationships are going to be very important as we look ahead, including with the council, the local council to the election officials, who are going to be leaned on more in this cycle probably than ever in the past.
Thank you for that, Liz. And I wasn't thinking as much about the risk of foreign interference, but with the loss that you and Stephen mentioned of the federal backstop, that's maybe a topic for another webinar in the spring. What could we be looking for? Ben, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Rick. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to speak from my lens, which is a municipal law enforcement lens. After having served in the District of Columbia, now working on police matters nationally and globally. If you would have asked most police chiefs 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, about polling places, election security, and if that was in their top 10 areas of concern, the answer would almost certainly be no. If it was in the top 50 of their concern, it probably still would be no compared to the wide range of issues. That, I think, is dramatically changing. And there's a lot of questions coming from the community about what the role of local law enforcement is and is not when it comes to that. Fundamentally, Washington, D.C. is a bit different than the rest of the country, and I can kind of try to draw some of those differences in later parts of the conversation. But most police chiefs now are aware that they're going to be potentially called upon, for a variety of different matters that come up, not about the actual election or scoring results or so forth, but what happens when there are federal officers or military troops that are stationed at or near polling places. What is the role of the local law enforcement agency, and what is it not? Those conversations need to be had sooner than later with policing officials and their local election officials to understand what responses could come to, both for legitimate law enforcement matters that are happening at or near polling places, but also just to better understand the positioning and posture that law enforcement will take. I think that there's a variety of concerns to kind of add emphasis to what Liz was raising regarding the actual infrastructure security and the role of various federal agencies that help with that. But certainly of concern to all of us should be what employees are there and how are they protecting the digital assets that come into elections and election security. That is not a local role, but that is a federal role, and ensuring that remains strong, both to defend from domestic, but in particular foreign interference is really important. In Washington, D.C., we saw increased activity before many of the presidential inaugurations with digital attempts from outside. Whether that was directed at the police department or other government assets, that remained of concern, and not something that local jurisdictions can really handle without really strong intervention from federal counterparts. I think of greatest concern to me is what happens when federal law enforcement is showing up at polling places. The public can interpret that as intimidation. I think we've seen, and we can dive in a bit into what's happened in the district as well. But if Immigration Customs Enforcement is doing traffic checkpoints near polling places, does that have an impact on individuals' likelihood to show up? And obviously, there's early voting and other ways to get out and vote. But the actual polling places and the impact that that could have is very real. Similarly, when the local community who do trust law enforcement are really looking to law enforcement officers to take action from what they perceive as election interference, making sure that local chiefs and sheriffs and officials that are appointed or elected to be in charge of public safety have a strategy, a communications plan, have worked with counterparts to understand what election officials want and don't want, and what the community expects and does not expect. I think the more clear that law enforcement leadership can be with their community ahead of time, and that is standing with their election officials to explain what people can see, how things are run, what safeguards are in place. And then also to the extent that local public safety officials are coordinating with federal counterparts to understand what operations they're doing, what will be happening. So, if, for example, there is a federal activation somewhere near a polling site, that the local partners might be able to speak to the media and the community in a way that the federal government might not be positioned or might not be willing to speak. I think the next point that I would add is regarding making sure that line officers are also familiar. It's wonderful that agency executives are knowledgeable and can speak to some of the things that I just talked about. But if the frontline officer, the person, the armed agent of the government that the member of the community is encountering, isn't knowledgeable about what their role is and is not, that is going to be a failure point or perception failure point across the board. So training is really important, and making sure that public sees law enforcement to the extent they're out there as neutral guardians of safety and protection, protectors of the democratic process. And building that trust between law enforcement and other elected officials in the community has to start well before the polling place opens. So law enforcement's presence should reassure voters, not discourage them. But it really certainly does matter of how they're being used and deployed, and that perception can carry a lot of weight. So those are just a few initial thoughts, and I'm happy to dive into that in a few questions here. You're muted.
Rick, you're on mute.
Of course, someone had to do it, and it might as well be the moderator.
Thank you for making us all feel good.
Okay, well, it's about 5 years since the beginning of COVID, and we're still don't know how to unmute. I would say, Ben, that I get more questions from the average person about the potential for federal law enforcement, or the use of the Insurrection Act, or some kind of federal troops on the ground during elections, more than any other question. Is there any way, I'll start with you, is there any way to assess how likely that is, or is this are we too far away from even thinking about it?
Well, if you'd have asked me 6 months ago, I would have said, we're nowhere near having federal troops deployed or federal law enforcement deployed. But I think the reality is we are, and we can reasonably expect that we'll see, maybe not for the purpose of interference, but for the purpose of, or the perceived purpose of added security or fairness. I think we'll definitely see that narrative, or it has a strong potential to come out. I want to differentiate. So Washington, D.C., which was really a flashpoint for a lot of testing grounds for authorities, is fundamentally different than most parts of the country. And so, based on the Home Rule statute, there exists the ability for the federal government to exercise what they did, which is limited control of the Metropolitan Police Department, in particular ability to give directives and leverage Metropolitan Police assets for various federal requests. That's fundamentally different than what exists in other parts. And so, I mean, I could spend an hour kind of dissecting this, which I won't do, but I think local communities need to understand the levels of their police authority. And one of the greatest things about this country is the federalism that exists. But that's really challenging on the law enforcement space. So if you take a normal state, for example, the governor is going to have some direct control over the state policing entity that exists there. And so depending the politics that exist in that state, You may or may not see a willingness or an appetite to leverage the state policing entity around polling places or for matters related to election security. Municipalities, same thing depending on the mayor or the city council or the city manager, and so forth. But fundamentally, the federal government is not going to be in a position, unless there are some significant legislation changes, to direct local or state local law enforcement in order to have any sort of presence or difference than those elected leaders would want in that community. Now, that's different than federal assets. And so federal assets can be deployed in the protection of federal buildings and federal locations, many of which might be polling places. But that's really where it's important for those local leaders to understand, where is the polling location? Who has protection authority on that? Is it possible that there could be deputization of local law enforcement to support federal? Sure. I mean, there's a lot of different iterations that could come down on this. But fundamentally, the federal government has a very limited number of law enforcement officers per capita. So that's going to have to be strategically placed in response. Now, National Guard, that's separate from law enforcement. And again, I think that comes back to the same conversation regarding some of the state level politics we saw, in California in particular, where the National Guard were deployed without the governor's specific ask. And all of this is playing out in court right now, which I think will have a lot of precedent to watch to see how this could play out in some of the polling locations.
I guess one bright side of the fact that Washington, D.C. has no congressional representation is there can be no interference with federal troops in electing a member of Congress there who actually has a vote in Congress. But that says something about the lack of representation in Washington, D.C. Liz, I know you had something you wanted to add on this point.
Well, yes, just again, this is a new concern for many people, but I will remind people that Section 592 of Title 18 prohibits military officers or other civilians from deploying troops or armed men to a place where election is being held unless necessary to repel armed enemies of the U.S. I will note that federal officials have taken this very seriously in the past, and some election officials have even told me that armed federal officials would not come meet them at their offices because they felt like that would potentially violate this prohibition. In response to some of the I think important points that Ben raised about how critical it is to work with law enforcement and to partner with them so they know what their role is. The Committee for Safe and Secure Elections is an entity that we work with, which brings together law enforcement and election officials so that they can do just that. So that they can meet, discuss what the relevant laws are in their state and what the expectations are regarding election security and what the role of law enforcement is and is not.
Sorry, man. Liz, does that only pertain to federal law enforcement and federal armed personnel?
So the Section 592 prohibits the deployment of, yes, federal officials. Federal,
Okay.
yes.
And what is National Guard classified as?
It depends.
Good legal answer.
And I think one of the things that played out very clearly in Washington, D.C. and is playing out now in other places is this test, right? This test to see what's permissible, and that can happen in a lot of different circumstances. And I would imagine, anytime the answer is it depends, we're going to see a variety of different tests to see kind of what those boundaries might exist. And that might also happen by local officials, not necessarily federal officials.
Stephen, I want to come to you with coming off the military question to a somewhat different question, which is I think about your experience in a swing state, kind of ground zero, Maricopa County. We knew in a presidential election that Arizona could be crucial to the outcome. This was true of the last few elections. That's when we're running a presidential election. This looks different when we're talking about, if we're talking about control of Congress, you're talking about 435 separate victors that have to be declared, and the couple of seats that put one party or the other over the top could be almost anywhere in the country.
Yep.
What does that mean in terms of I'm thinking about the preparedness of people in California who haven't had to face the kind of stuff you had to face in Arizona because, you're the swing state, you're under the microscope. Here, again, let's take California where it takes a very long time to count mail. We have a ton of mail-in ballots and a ton of people. It takes a long time to declare a winner. And what's that going to mean for those local election officials, and what should they be doing to prepare for these kinds of the kind of public pressure that might come and the microscope?
Yeah, one of the benefits that California has at least recently had is that its statewide elections, in terms of partisan statewide elections, have not been terribly close. But when we're talking about the US House, there are quite a few districts in California that could factor into that significantly. So I think you need to start thinking ahead of time. Do I have one of those US House seats that could potentially affect the balance of power writ large in the United States? And if so, be ready for the fact that if the networks can't call the race 3, 4, 5 days after election day, then all of a sudden they're going to descend on you, and the world is going to learn the name of your county potentially, just like everyone now knows, oh, Maricopa County, you're from Maricopa County? I know where Maricopa County is. And so with that comes lots of news media, lots of political party representatives, lots of protesters, lots of people shouting at you, either stop the count or keep counting. And I would say, while the presidential, nothing's like the presidential. For us, 2022 was more challenging than was 2024, just because the results in Arizona in 2024 were more easily ascertained. And in 2022, when we had those razor-thin margins on a couple statewide races with charismatic candidates, it was so incredibly painful. And so really what you should be preparing for isn't, the fact that it's not a presidential, but just that your county might be a component of the razor-thin margin in a U.S. House race, which could be on a razor-thin margin overall.
That's helpful and frightening, I think, in terms of I think a lot of people who have not gone through this are in these non-swing states that now may face unprecedented scrutiny. I want to turn to Liz first, and then maybe Ben, on this idea about getting community leaders involved in shoring up local election officials. Ben talked about the role of the law enforcement meeting with election officials, but I'm thinking more broadly about church leaders, about business leaders, union leaders, like pillars of the community. Liz, what's the role of civil society in all of this?
I think civil society plays a really critical role, especially when our system is under duress and under attack. These community leaders can be absolutely the single trusted voice that community members will listen to. And if the community leaders have an existing relationship with the local election official, that will ensure that these community leaders have the actual truth and can share the actual and accurate information with their community members. So I think they can play a really important role, and there are efforts ongoing to bring these people to the table, to build these relationships. And it's important that we and the election officials and the community leaders start that process now, because you can't do it overnight.
Ben, thinking about this and thinking about specifically the social media and the way that rumors can spread, and how can leaders get the word out that these are the trusted sources, like what you've heard about ballots being tampered with or something like that, that's not true. It's a lot harder now. It used to be there were a few social media companies, and I remember when Stephen made a video with that was with Bill Gates, not the Bill Gates, but the other Bill Gates, to try to in real time deal with this. But now it's like people are everywhere. So is there a communication strategy that might help here?
So I think law enforcement is well positioned to deal with this issue you're describing. It happens every day to an agency around the country where something that's a routine crime, report somehow gets amplified or mischaracterized, and all of a sudden, if not prepared with a good, solid communication strategy, agency leaders are finding themselves responding to, to a massive, perceived issue, and then, the confusion that comes from that. So to Liz's point, the civil society leaders and law enforcement need to be together in the room having these conversations. These can't be siloed conversations. Strong communications plans need to be developed up front. Response plans of, like, if we have a report to X, how are we handling this? What are the communication channels to verify it? Who are the key contacts in the community or community leaders that will be called or notified or are present in the room in order to have that information in advance? And those are plans that happen months and months in advance of an election. That shouldn't be happening the day of, where it's like, oh, we need to put together this messaging or the response. Making sure that the information is accurate before it goes out, speaking to what is known and not known. So, for example, if there is a presence of, or law enforcement, something that's outside a polling place, being able to speak to what it is, have the contacts in order to define that up front is helpful. And to be able to use those credible voices in the community. A lot of departments want to wait until they can verify, 101%. But right now in the era of social media, you got to acknowledge something. And so, even a statement saying, the department is aware of this, and an update will be provided, is something to acknowledge. And I'm not saying, give life to something that doesn't deserve life. But if an agency is being silent and a rumor is being fueled on social media, you have to be prepared to address that. The longer it goes, the bigger it gets, and it's harder to claw back that narrative. The more people that are trusted in the community that can add to that conversation, to the different spheres that they can speak to, the better it will be able to be controlled.
Thank you for that. And just to remind those of you who are looking to get MCLE credit, that there is a link in the chat box, and it'll be posted again to do that. Also, there's a long queue of 14 questions I see. I'll turn to those in about 10 minutes, and we'll have the last 10 to 15 minutes to go through some of those. But I want to turn back to federal agencies. We heard a bit about CISA. That's the cybersecurity aspect of the federal government. We haven't talked much, although Stephen did mention the role of the United States Election Assistance Commission, which was directed in the first executive order to do certain things related to voter registration forms that has been put on hold by a court. And there's also the Department of Justice, which was directed to do certain things in that first executive order. So let me go to Stephen and then to Liz on the question of these federal agencies, and what might be different in 2026 compared to the role that they played in 2024.
I think there will be more of a shift, or the Department of Justice might be looking more at the election administration process than they will be looking at disruptors to the election administration process. So looking more inside the House rather than outside the House. And I think the clearest manifestation of this was the disbandment of the Elections Threats Task Force that the Department of Justice had stood up in the 3 years previously, which didn't result in a large number of prosecutions, but signaled to the country that you can't make death threats to election officials in impunity. Now, I think most of the noise comes in terms of rooting out election administrators who are bad or uncovering fraudulent processes, which, of course, if there's a fraudulent process, then it should be investigated by any authority with a law enforcement. But there might be a little more reluctance from election administrators to go to the Department of Justice or to the FBI when somebody like a Heather Honey has joined the DOJ. And Heather Honey was somebody who very much propagated theories that the 2020 election and the 2022 elections in some circumstances were stolen. She's endorsed some pretty outlandish theories of election fraud. And so I think that To me, more interesting than what's going on at CISA and what's going on at the EAC would be how does the Department of Justice and the FBI act going into 2026. I will say that the Department of Justice I have great respect for, and there are many, many men and women, and we have who are wonderful in the department, and we have processes. But clearly, some of the rhetoric has at least shifted, and will that manifest in different action? I don't know yet.
Liz, what are you seeing here?
So I'll mention a meeting that's happening tomorrow. So the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, has two main roles. One is to serve as a clearinghouse of best practices for election administration procedures, and the other is to establish the voluntary voting system guidelines. So these are typically security guidelines that voting equipment must follow in order to obtain VBSG certification. In the past, when the VVSG standards have been updated, it's been a somewhat collaborative and typically slow process. Right now, in response, what appears to be in response to the executive order, the EAC has launched an effort to promote and move forward with VVSG 2.1. The process at the EAC to move forward with this requires consultation with multiple different boards that they have, one of which is the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, typically called the TGDC. This is the committee where in the past, new versions of the VBSG have originated. So the VBSG has yet another meeting scheduled for tomorrow, at which they will be able to provide feedback on the currently drafted VBSG, which would prohibit the use of barcodes as required in the executive order.
Thank you for that. And there was a lot of alphabet soup in there, but there's a lot at stake in these things. I'm going to turn to some audience questions, and I have a list of my own, but I do want to get through some of these. And let me go to Ben first with a couple of questions that are in the same neighborhood. One a watcher of the program asks, could a Republican governor request federal law enforcement to target blue precincts specifically? And another person asks, what would be the process to counter federal government potentially putting out false terror threats in order to decrease turnout in certain jurisdictions? So these are both seem to be like, what if the federal government were aimed targeting certain communities to try to affect the outcome of an election?
I mean, I'm going to start by saying I hopefully both of these are purely hypotheticals, but just playing along with the hypotheticals for a second, for either a red governor or blue governor to request, federal law enforcement to be deployed to a polling location, it's going to depend on, federal law enforcement. In theory, okay, I'm going to operate within confines of what the law would presume as well. But the jurisdiction that the polling place is going to have a huge impact of whether or not a federal law enforcement presence would even be naturally there. And really, that's Federal Protective Services. If it was a federal building, they only have a limited number of officers nationally. Could FBI, ATF, DEA, or marshals or someone else be there to support? I don't think that's realistic for how that would play out. I think if that was a governor request, it would be an increased presence of law enforcement for things like immigration enforcement, and some of the same things that we've seen play out in Washington, D.C. and some of the other cities that aren't necessarily targeted specifically at the polling place, but might happen in the proximity, again, with the idea of voter suppression. I think that's how that in theory could play out. But to the specific question, could a governor request the FBI or ATF to sit on a particular location? We're in bizarre times sometimes, but I don't think that there's a lot of precedent for that request to be made because there's not a federal crime or criminal investigation or nexus to that. But I give that within the caveats of the normal confines. And Rick, hit me with the second piece of that question as well, please.
It was about the false terror threats to
I mean,
increase
that would
turnout.
be holistically counter to Any agency SOP, likely grounds for significant litigation if found to be occurring, detrimental to the trust of the federal government if doing that. Again, I put the caveat that anything's possible, but there's a variety of institutional, I'm sure, whistleblower claims that would come up the moment that something like that happened, that would play out both, internally, but very publicly as well. Again, and anything is possible, but I just don't believe that that is a likely component, at least from what I see now.
Thank you. There are a few questions about the president's power. One asks about the president's power to cancel elections. Another asks about the president's power to ban mail-in voting. I can take those and say that's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says that states run elections. Congress can come in and override those rules as to congressional elections. Otherwise, the president's job is to carry out the laws. But which brings me to this related question. I want to start with Stephen on this and then all of you can chime in. There's a difference between the president's power on paper, and then there's the power of persuasion and the kind of the bully pulpit, the information environment. Do you see that as a bigger potential problem with interfering with the 2026 elections, that use of soft power compared to the president's actual authority, say, over law enforcement or over DOJ or something like that?
Well, I would say the president seems very willing to test the limits of his power, and sometimes will ask for forgiveness rather than permission if he does indeed ask for forgiveness. And so it wouldn't surprise me if much of this is litigated in a very exigent manner, and then you're asking for injunctive orders to prevent the government from doing something. But with respect to mail voting in particular, I don't know any serious legal scholar who thinks that the president has authority to unilaterally do away with mail voting throughout the country through an executive order. And I think that probably the president's own team told him that after his Truth Social post, which is why it didn't result in an executive order. That being said, of course, he can have a profound impact on voter behavior, and he has had a profound impact on voter behavior. And for the last few cycles, Democrats have used mail-in voting more than Republicans have across the country. Now, the gap closed in that in 2024. The president, the RNC, groups like Turning Point USA, very much made it a central component of their campaigns was to utilize mail voting, utilize any type of voting. And so I'm a little bit surprised that the president would reverse course on that. Some of the cynics out there would say he reads the writing on the wall, that the 26 elections aren't going to go well, and that this is sowing the seeds for contestation to the elections, whether it's through certification of tabulation equipment that was ambiguous, or through the continued use of mail voting, even when he had signed a executive order to the contrary. I don't know why, but I was a little disappointed that the president, who himself has used mail voting many a time and who presided over a very successful campaign in 24 in which many Republicans voted by mail, would say that.
Liz, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. And Stephen's reference to Turning Point USA reminded me of the despicable assassination of Charlie Kirk and the kind of the atmosphere of fear that many people who are in the public space, including election officials, face. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it'd be nice to have a president who turned down the temperature overall. That's not what we have. And I'm just wondering, again, about that use of the bully pulpit, like, what are you expecting and what can be done to counteract any kind of increase in the kind of inflammatory rhetoric?
I mean, it is chilling to me the number of election officials who worked very hard to ensure that the 2020 election was safe and secure despite huge challenges, who have said that they are concerned that they could be arrested for just doing their jobs in the current environment, which is anyway, just shocking and horrifying. But I think that, we've seen in the past where election officials and state officials have pushed back on the DOJ when they have engaged in overreach in elections. So back in 2024, the DOJ attempted to send election monitors to locations in Missouri and Texas. And Texas pushed back, and the DOJ settled with them and agreed that they would not place election monitors in the polling locations. They would only be allowed to remain outside the polling location. So in the event that election officials have questions about whether or not the DOJ has authority to request or demand information, the election officials need to consult with their attorneys. And again, I think as I mentioned earlier, the attorneys for the local election officials are going to play an incredibly important role this cycle. And I think that just like many others, becoming more familiar with the legal restrictions on potential federal interference is important.
I want to end by taking a riff off of a question that's in the chat and ask you each to comment on this. The questioner asks, what are the key gaps in our preparation and what can philanthropists do? But I want to make it broader and say, because I get this question all the time, what can I do as the average person to try to assure that we have free and fair elections in 2026 and beyond? I sometimes point to decentralization being a strength, that there are many points of entry, but I don't know if any of you have any specific thoughts you like that. Ben, why don't I start with you, and then I'll go to Stephen, and we'll close with Liz.
Sure. I mean, I think democracy works because of everyone's involvement, right? And this is not the time to sit on the sidelines and hope someone else speaks up for you. So, advocating, writing your council members, writing your, elected officials, writing your, whether it's a mayor or whatever, wherever you live, encouraging them to be thinking about these issues and what we've talked about here today. Philanthropic dollars are only going to go so far on these type of issues, and certainly there's a lot of gaps to fill and to support. But they're not going to fill the space of national security and defense unless I'm missing a donor I'd love to reach out and certainly have plenty of ideas. But there's a lot of ways that I think just right now, in particular with the decentralized system, Rick, to your point, there's a lot of strengths to that. The weaknesses are, it's going to be a town where nobody's thinking about this issue in a place that somehow becomes very contested and folks are underprepared, and that becomes the flashpoint. So, really that local advocacy, and widespread advocacy to ensure that there's plans in place, that folks are talking, that this is well covered. We're best suited by that.
Stephen.
I think I'm honor bound for the rest of my life to say that you should participate in election administration. As a former election official, I'm supposed to say, please volunteer, please sign up to get paid, please, if nothing else, volunteer with your political party to be an observer at various election points. But I will make a more global statement as to what you can do. Election night is very challenging for election officials, especially for election officials in closely contested jurisdictions. You have all of your voting locations coming back. You're processing 100 different moving parts, 1,000 different moving parts, and you have a whole bunch of people who are anxious, understandably so, anxious to know the results of the election. And then in recent years, you have another element, which is you have a lot of vitriol in person outside of your facility. And if you go online, it can be a very depressing place. And so I think this speaks to a broader problem we have. And we've obviously witnessed this in spades in the last week with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, with the assassination of Melissa Horton in Minnesota. This doesn't know just Republicans, this doesn't know just Democrats, but take the temperature down. Be part of the citizenry that takes the temperature down. I recently wrote an article just thinking about it myself for 10 things that you can do to help bring the political temperature down. But given where our economy is at, given where we are in the global world, This should not be the most tense moment, or as tense a moment as it is, and yet I think that people can, it's palatable. And so if you want to help election administrators and if you want to help broader society, I would say be the person who takes a breath before writing a comment online or yelling at somebody, and be part of the peacemakers as we move towards the next midterm elections.
Thank you. And Liz, will come to you for the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but I would also add that everybody watching here certainly can identify who their local election official is. They can understand what the procedures and requirements are to register and to vote, and the options to register to vote in their jurisdiction, and they can help inform their circle and their network about the facts. And it's not just going to be before the election, but again, potentially after the election, when people who are unhappy with the results might make false allegations about the integrity of our election system.
Well, Ben Haiman, Stephen Richer, Liz Howard, thank you all for an enlightening and, I would say, if not uplifting, somewhat reassuring discussion about what lies ahead. Let me remind you all watching that the next event will be on Tuesday, October 7th at 12:15 p.m. Pacific time. And I'll be in conversation with Nate Pursley on lessons from 2024 for 2026. I'm Rick Hasen of UCLA Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time. Bye-bye.